fatal valentine, betrayal, revenge, and 15 gunshots. Valentine's night was meant to be a celebration of love and passion. But instead, it turned into a nightmare drenched in blood. A Florida police officer came home, only to discover a scene that would shatter her world: her husband in bed with her 14-year-old son. Betrayal, disgust, and fury ignited all at once. Overcome with uncontrollable rage, she reached for her gun. Was it an act of justice or sheer madness? 15 shots rang out, tearing through the silence of the night, turning their home into the scene of a gruesome tragedy. What drove her to commit such a shocking act? Was this the desperate retaliation of a scorned wife, or was there something even darker at play? And what role did her teenage son have in this horrifying story? Before we dive into the chilling details of this case, don't forget to subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless.
Naomi Green was the kind of officer people trusted. A decorated Miami-Dade police officer with nearly a decade of service, she had built a reputation for her sharp instincts, level-headedness, and unwavering commitment to justice. She had solved difficult cases, comforted victims in their darkest moments, and earned the respect of both her colleagues and the community she served. To those who knew her, she was not just a cop. She was a protector, a woman who carried the weight of responsibility with pride. But Naomi wasn't just an officer. She was a mother and a wife, fiercely devoted to her family. She had married young, eager to build a life with Marcellus Green, a man who had seemed like everything she wanted: charming, ambitious, and determined to provide for their future. He had swept her off her feet in their early years, promising her the kind of stability she had always dreamed of. Her husband, with his striking presence and smooth-talking charisma, he had built a successful career, sealing high-stakes deals and making a name for himself in Miami's competitive market. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention, turning casual conversations into business opportunities. He prided himself on his ability to network, to connect with people, to convince even the most reluctant clients to trust him. His work provided the Greens with a comfortable life, one filled with luxury vacations, private school for their son, and a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood. That son, 14-year-old Jalen Green, was bright and introspective. Unlike most kids his age, he wasn't drawn to sports or video games. Instead, he immersed himself in art and film, spending hours sketching scenes from his imagination or editing short videos on his computer. He had dreams of becoming a filmmaker, capturing stories the way he saw them in his head. Together, the Greens formed a close-knit family, where Naomi balanced her demanding job with the nurturing of her home, and Marcellus worked tirelessly to provide for them. Their bond was built on love, respect, and shared goals. Their home was a place where their dreams aligned, each member working toward a future they believed in. But on the night of February 14, 2023, Naomi Green walked into her home and discovered a scene that would forever alter the course of her life. In the weeks leading up to February 14, 2023, Naomi Green couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in her home. At first it was just little things, easy to dismiss. Jalen, her bright, expressive son, wasn't talking as much. He used to ramble on about his latest video edits, his sketches, his dream of making films one day. Now he barely looked up from his desk when she entered his room. It wasn't just silence, it was avoidance. Whenever Naomi tried to hug him, he tensed. Whenever she asked how he was doing, he gave short, clipped answers, like he was trying to get away as fast as possible. And then there was Marcellus. Marcellus Green was a man who commanded rooms. Charismatic, confident, successful, he was the kind of man people trusted instinctively. For over a decade, he had built a name for himself in Miami's real estate market, sealing deals with a handshake and a smile. He had given Naomi and Jalen a beautiful home, a comfortable life. On paper, they were the perfect family. But lately, Naomi had started noticing things about him that didn't sit right. The way he and Jalen would go quiet the second she walked into a room. The way Jalen's posture stiffened when Marcellus placed a hand on his shoulder. And the phone. Marcellus's phone never left his side anymore. It was always buzzing, lighting up with notifications that he quickly dismissed before she could see. If Naomi so much as glanced in its direction, he would pick it up and walk away. She wasn't the type to pry. She had never been the jealous wife, the suspicious type. She and Marcellus had built their marriage on trust, or so she had believed. But her gut was telling her something was off. Her instincts as a cop screamed at her that there was something she wasn't seeing, but as a mother, she didn't want to believe it. On the night of February 14, 2023, Naomi had no idea she was about to walk into a nightmare. She had planned everything, a surprise dinner, a quiet night for just the two of them. Life had been busy, and she wanted to bring back a little of the warmth they once had. She left work early, stopping at the store to buy wine and Marcellus's favorite dessert. She hummed along to the radio as she drove home, thinking about how happy he would be when he saw what she had planned. She was still smiling when she walked through the front door. Naomi walked into the house just after 9 p.m., expecting to find Marcellus waiting for her. It was Valentine's Day, and she had planned a surprise, a quiet, intimate dinner, just the two of them. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. The living room was exactly as she had left it that morning, neat, undisturbed. There were no sounds of the TV, no music playing, no sign of Jalen. That in itself was strange. He was always working on something, his laptop whirring as he edited videos, soft music playing as he sketched. But tonight there was nothing, just silence. Then she heard it, a faint murmur, whispers. Her stomach tightened. The sound was coming from upstairs. Naomi's pulse picked up as she climbed the staircase, her shoes soundless against the carpeted steps. As she neared the bedroom, the whispers grew clearer, but she couldn't make out the words. Her heart pounded harder, her body tensing with a feeling she couldn't explain. Something was wrong. She reached the door. The light inside was on. The whispers stopped. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the doorknob. For a second she considered knocking. But a voice in her head, her instincts, the ones that had kept her alive all these years as a cop, told her not to wait. She pushed the door open. And then the world stopped. Marcellus was there. So was Jalen. Naomi's brain struggled to process what she was seeing. Her husband, her strong, confident, charming husband, was in bed, his shirt unbuttoned, his belt undone. And Jalen, her son, her baby, was curled up against the headboard, his face streaked with tears, his body trembling. His hands clutched the sheets, gripping them so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't moving. He looked frozen, trapped. For a moment, no one said anything. Naomi couldn't breathe. Her body went ice-cold, her ears ringing so loudly she barely registered her own sharp inhale. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with something unspeakable. Marcellus moved first. He yanked his belt back through the loops, fumbling with his shirt. His eyes met Naomi's, wide with shock, with something else, panic. "Baby, don't," Naomi whispered. Her voice barely worked. Jalen's eyes locked onto hers, pleading, silent. Naomi's stomach twisted, a sickening realization crashing over her. This wasn't the first time. She felt her knees buckle, but she caught herself. A deep, guttural scream ripped from her throat, shaking the walls. "What the hell is this?" Marcellus stepped toward her, his hands raised as if he could control this, as if he could talk his way out of what she had just seen. "Naomi, listen to me." But she was already reaching for her gun. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She wasn't a cop in this moment. She was a mother. Her fingers wrapped around the familiar grip, her training kicking in, but not in the way it was supposed to. "I'm calling 911, she choked out. Jalen flinched at the words. His whole body jerked like he had been struck. Marcellus took another step forward. "Naomi, put the gun down. This isn't what you think. Let's talk about this." His voice was smooth, too smooth, like he still believed he could manipulate her, like he thought he could make her doubt what she had just seen with her own eyes. Her grip tightened. She wasn't doubting anything. "Get away from me," she hissed. Jalen made a noise, something between a sob and a gasp. Naomi's eyes flicked to him just for a second, and that was when Marcellus lunged. He moved fast, his hand shooting out, trying to grab her wrist to take the gun. He had always been stronger, but Naomi had something he didn't. Pure, unfiltered rage. She pulled the trigger. The first shot hit him in the chest. He stumbled, eyes wide in disbelief. She fired again, and again. Marcellus staggered back, hitting the dresser, knocking over the framed wedding photo that had sat there for years. The glass shattered as it hit the floor. But Naomi didn't stop. 15 shots. 15. Each one burned with betrayal, with fury, with the unbearable pain of knowing she had been sleeping beside a monster. The last shot echoed in the room, then silence. Marcellus's body slumped to the floor, blood spread across the white carpet. His eyes, once so full of life, stared at nothing. It was over. The gun felt heavy in Naomi's hands. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the way her body trembled. But all of that faded when she turned to Jalen. He hadn't moved. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His lips were parted, his face pale. For the first time since she had entered the room, he made a sound. A broken, whispered word. "Mom." And then from downstairs, sirens. The neighbors had heard the gunshots. The police were coming. Naomi's breath hitched. She had just killed her husband, and her son had watched it all. The gunfire shattered the silence of the house, echoing through the walls, spilling out into the night. The smell of gunpowder mixed with something metallic. Blood. Naomi stood there, frozen, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. The gun in her hand felt heavier than it ever had before. Marcellus wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. The only sound in the room was the steady drip of blood soaking into the white carpet, the distant hum of the city outside. But inside this room, inside this house, time had stopped. Jalen hadn't moved either. He was still pressed against the headboard, his body trembling, his face, God, his face, terror, disbelief, relief, and then piercing through the heavy silence, sirens. They were getting louder, closer. The neighbors must have heard the shots. Maybe someone had already called 911. Naomi blinked, her vision blurry, her mind spinning. She knew what came next. She had been on the other side of this scene too many times to count. But this time she wasn't the cop walking in with her gun drawn, assessing the damage. She was the one standing over the body. The blue and red lights flashed through the window. Voices shouted from outside. Her fellow officers, her colleagues, the people she had worked with for years. Then, banging on the door. "Miami-Dade police, open up!" More voices, more footsteps, then the sound of the door being kicked in. Naomi didn't move. She couldn't. It wasn't until the first officer stormed into the bedroom, his gun raised, that reality snapped back into place. "Drop your weapon." For a split second her training told her to respond, to de-escalate, but then she realized she was the threat now. Slowly she loosened her grip on the gun. It slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. "Get on your knees, hands behind your head." She did. Rough hands yanked her arms behind her, cold steel cuffs locking around her wrists. Someone was shouting, more officers flooding into the room, barking orders, securing the scene. Suspect in custody. Male victim down, multiple gunshot wounds. And then, "We need EMS for the kid." "Jalen." Naomi's head snapped toward him. Two officers were kneeling beside him, checking for injuries, speaking in low, careful voices. But Jalen wasn't answering them. His eyes were still locked on her, his lips slightly parted, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Tears spilled down his face, silent and unending. They pulled Naomi to her feet, leading her out of the room, past the body of the man she once loved, past the broken shards of their wedding photo on the floor. The walk through the house felt surreal. The home she had built with Marcellus, the one filled with birthday parties, late-night movies, and family dinners, it was all gone now. Everything had changed in a single night. By the time they got her outside, the street was filled with flashing lights, squad cars and news vans already setting up their cameras. A crowd had gathered, neighbors whispering, their faces pale with shock. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered, "That's Naomi Green." A decorated officer, a respected cop, now a murderer. She didn't say a word as they put her in the back of the police car, the doors shut, muffling the chaos outside. At the station, everything happened in a blur. The booking process, the fingerprinting, the mugshot. Naomi barely registered any of it. The only thing she cared about was Jalen. "Where's my son?" she asked the second she was taken into the interrogation room. The detective across from her, a man she had worked with on countless cases, folded his hands together. "He's in protective custody." Naomi exhaled, her shoulders slumping. Jalen was safe. That was all that mattered. When they asked for her statement, she told them everything. She didn't hesitate. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told them about the whispers, the tension, the way Jalen had changed over the last few months. She told them how she had ignored her instincts for too long, how she had walked into that bedroom and seen the unthinkable. And then she told them about the moment she snapped. The moment she stopped thinking like a cop and started thinking like a mother. The detective, listening to her, never interrupted. He just nodded, taking notes, his expression unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. "You understand what's going to happen now," he finally said. "I understand," Naomi answered. He studied her for a moment. "Do you regret it?" Naomi met his gaze without blinking. "I did what any mother would do," she said. "I protected my son." The courtroom was suffocating, packed with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had followed the case from the moment the news broke. It was a circus of flashing cameras and murmured speculation. Naomi Green sat at the defense table, her hands clasped together, her face expressionless. The weight of the past few months had settled deep into her bones, but she refused to let it show. She had spent years as a cop, trained to keep her emotions in check. Now, more than ever, she needed that skill. But this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another defendant sitting before a judge, awaiting a fate decided by strangers. This time, it was her. And in the front row, her son sat, hands clenched in his lap, shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. Jalen hadn't spoken much since that night. Not to her, not to his family, not to the therapists who had tried to coax words out of him. He had spent weeks in a near catatonic state, going through the motions, barely eating, barely sleeping. It was like something inside him had fractured, and Naomi feared that no amount of time would be enough to repair it. She had tried to explain, tried to reach out in the only way she could from behind bars, through letters, through messages sent through her lawyer, through the handful of times she had been allowed to see him sitting across from her in the cold, sterile visitors' room at the jail, his eyes hollow, his voice barely above a whisper. But the truth was, she didn't know if he would ever forgive her. She had killed his father, and now she was going to pay the price. The prosecution wasted no time tearing into her. "She fired 15 shots, the lead prosecutor said, his voice sharp as a knife. "Not one, not two, 15. This was not self-defense. This was not a split-second decision. This was cold-blooded murder." Naomi swallowed hard but kept her face neutral. She knew what they were doing, painting her as an executioner, a woman consumed by rage, a police officer who had sworn to uphold the law and instead took it into her own hands. They called witnesses, neighbors who had heard the gunshots, First responders who had found her standing over Marcellus's body, her gun still in her hands. Forensics experts who detailed the trajectory of each bullet, who showed crime scene photos so gruesome that some members of the jury turned away. And then, there was the moment she had been dreading. Jalen was called to the stand. The courtroom was silent as he walked up, his movements slow, careful, as if he were carrying something fragile inside of him that might break if he stepped too hard. He sat down, his fingers twisting together in his lap. The defense attorney approached him gently. "Jalen, can you tell us about your relationship with your father?" Jalen hesitated. His throat worked as he swallowed, and for a moment, Naomi wasn't sure he would answer. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, "He wasn't who everyone thought he was." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Naomi's chest tightened. The attorney nodded encouragingly. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" Jalen's fingers clenched. His whole body seemed to shrink inward. He hurt me." His voice wavered, but he kept going. "For months, I was scared. I didn't tell anyone because I thought no one would believe me." His eyes flickered toward the prosecution table, then back down. "He always told me that if I told my mom she would hate me, that it would ruin everything." Naomi felt her nails dig into her palms. The jury was watching Jalen now, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. The prosecutor, who had been so sharp, so unrelenting, now looked uneasy, shifting in his seat. "And on the night of February 14th, what happened?" Jalen inhaled shakily. I was in his room. He told me to stay quiet, but then the door opened, and my mom was there, and she just started screaming." His hands clenched tighter. "She tried to call 911, but he tried to stop her, and then she—" His voice cracked. "She shot him." There it was. The truth laid bare. Naomi wanted to reach out, to hold him, to tell him it was okay, that she had done what she had done because she loved him, because she had to protect him. But she couldn't. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, Naomi forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression calm. No matter what the verdict was, she would accept it. The judge looked solemn as he read the words, "Guilty of voluntary manslaughter." A rush of sound filled the room, whispers, gasps, the frantic scribbling of reporters. Naomi exhaled slowly. Not murder, not life in prison. But still, she wasn't free. The judge continued, "This court recognizes the deep emotional weight of this case. The pain suffered by both the victim's son and the defendant is immeasurable. However, justice cannot be served through vigilante action. The law must still apply." A pause. Naomi Green is sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. A sharp gasp. Naomi wasn't sure if it came from her or from someone in the crowd. 25 years. The bailiff approached and Naomi turned her head, searching for Jalen. Their eyes met across the courtroom. She mouthed the words, "I love you." For the first time in months, Jalen didn't look away. Tears shimmered in his eyes. And then, she was led away. This case forces us to confront difficult questions. Was Naomi justified in her actions? Should she have let the law handle it? Or did the justice system fail to recognize the instinct of a mother who snapped in the face of horror?